When World War II ended, the United States found itself with hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war, POWs, many of whom were German soldiers captured in various campaigns. Among these prisoners, a significant number were brought to the United States for internment and labor, with Texas serving as one of the largest holding grounds. The POWs, who had been accustomed to the rigid military discipline and far more controlled environments of war, were taken aback when they were put to work in the vast open ranches of Texas, where the labor was far from what they had imagined. Most of the German POWs had been captured during the North African campaign or the fighting across Western Europe. Many had been soldiers in the Wehrmacht, while others were members of different branches of the Nazi war machine, and still others were from less traditional military units. They had been through brutal combat, facing harsh desert environments, muddy European fields, and fierce battles. But nothing could have prepared them for the unforgiving and demanding conditions they would encounter in Texas. Texas, with its wide open spaces and booming agricultural industry, was a perfect place to house POWs. The U.S. government, needing to deal with the vast numbers of prisoners captured during the war, sought to utilize their labor to support the country's agricultural and industrial needs. This included working on farms and ranches, where there was an ongoing need for workers, especially given that many American men had been sent off to war. Although it might have seemed like a simple assignment, just keeping prisoners housed and fed, the situation in Texas proved far more complex. What the German POWs were not prepared for was the type of labor they would be required to perform. The POWs arrived in Texas expecting some semblance of comfort and a minimal amount of work. They had heard about other POW camps where prisoners were not required to do very much at all, and their expectations were shaped by that experience. However, upon arriving in Texas, they quickly learned that things were different. Rather than being housed in barracks with a few chores or assigned to light-duty tasks, they were sent to work on cattle ranches where they were expected to perform some of the most physically demanding labor imaginable. Tasks included herding cattle, repairing fences, and managing the day-to-day activities required to maintain large ranching operations. The scale of the work was nothing like the POWs had encountered before. In many cases, the physical demands of the job were overwhelming, especially for those who had not worked with livestock or in agricultural settings before. The German soldiers, many of whom had been part of an industrialized and mechanized army, had never been involved in the hard manual labor required on a cattle ranch. Initially, many of the German POWs were shocked. The bright Texas sun, the vast open spaces, the relentless physical exertion, all of it stood in stark contrast to the more controlled, regimented life they had known in the military. In Europe, many had seen combat, but few had encountered the rugged, back-breaking labor that came with working on a cattle ranch in the American West. They were forced to work long hours in the unforgiving heat, performing tasks that required both physical strength and a strong sense of practical know-how. The cultural differences between the German soldiers and the Texans were also stark. While many of the POWs had come from urbanized parts of Germany or occupied territories, the Texans they encountered were often from rural backgrounds, and they had little in common except the fact that they were now in the same place, bound by circumstances. The Texans, many of whom were ranchers and farmers, were used to hard work, and they didn't see the need to coddle the prisoners. To them, the POWs were simply another source of labor that could help keep their ranches running during a time of war. The POWs, on the other hand, had little to no understanding of the everyday realities of life on a ranch. They were unprepared for the grueling tasks that lay before them. At first, there was a significant amount of tension between the POWs and their captors. Cultural misunderstandings were common, as many of the POWs spoke only German and had little to no experience with the English language or the informal ways of life on the ranches. The Americans, in turn, had little patience for what they saw as the prisoners' laziness or lack of initiative. However, as time went on, some level of understanding began to form. While there was no mistaking the fact that the POWs were being used for hard labor, they started to adapt. Many of the German soldiers, particularly those with agricultural or rural backgrounds, began to use their skills to their advantage, gaining a certain amount of respect from the Texans they worked with. Interestingly, The Texans themselves had little official training in managing prisoners of war. Instead, they approached the situation in a far more informal, practical way. They understood that the prisoners had to be kept busy, and that it was important for them to feel productive. In some cases, the Texans taught the prisoners about ranching, showing them how to manage cattle, fix fences, and operate basic machinery. Over time, the POWs came to realize that their captors were not simply adversaries, but had knowledge that they could learn from. And this allowed for a begrudging mutual respect to develop between the two groups. For many of the German POWs, the work on the Texas ranches would turn out to be life-changing. Some of them had never before worked with cattle or had any experience in the agricultural field. The tough physical labor was often grueling, but for many, it was a way to regain some sense of self-worth, as they were no longer just soldiers caught up in the machinery of war. The work provided a break from the mental anguish of war and captivity. It also allowed them to see a side of American life that was far different from what they had imagined, helping them to understand the resilience and practicality of their captors. For some, the experience would eventually lead to a career in ranching or farming after the war ended, while for others, the lessons learned in the fields of Texas would be a lasting reminder of their time in captivity. The shocking nature of the labor on the cattle ranches was not just about the physical demands. It was about the profound contrast between what the German POWs had expected and what they actually encountered. Working on a cattle ranch in Texas was not something they had been trained for, nor something they had ever imagined themselves doing. But the experience ultimately shaped their lives, leaving a lasting impression on many of them about the vastness of America, the resilience of the people who worked its land, and the complexities of captivity and survival. Most of the German POWs who found themselves in Texas during World War II were captured in the wake of the North African Campaign and the battles that followed across Europe. By the time the United States began to capture large numbers of German soldiers, the war had already taken a significant toll on both sides. For the Germans, the war in Africa and Europe had drained their resources, manpower, and morale. Their soldiers were battle-weary, often struggling to adapt to the ever-changing demands of a world at war. The Germans had been fighting a war on multiple fronts, including the brutal desert terrain of North Africa and the muddy, frozen fields of the Eastern Front. The Mediterranean and North Africa campaigns were particularly grueling, with vast distances to cover, extreme heat, and a shortage of supplies. German soldiers had learned to adapt to these harsh environments, but their expectations of the war had been shaped by the speed and tactics of blitzkrieg warfare, where rapid advances were the norm. Many of the prisoners captured in these campaigns had been part of elite military units, including the Afrika Korps, which had been at the forefront of Nazi Germany's North African military efforts. After the fall of Tunisia in May 1943 and the defeat of German forces in the Battle of Stalingrad, the number of German POWs increased significantly. With the ongoing Allied invasion of Italy and the D-Day landings in Normandy in 1944, German forces were pushed further and further back. The US and British forces captured thousands of soldiers, many of whom had been part of the Wehrmacht or other branches of the German military. These soldiers were taken prisoner and shipped to the United States for internment. While the majority of these soldiers were sent to prison camps in states like Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Mississippi, Texas became one of the largest centers for German POWs. By the time the POWs arrived in Texas, many had been through hellish conditions on the battlefield. They were often exhausted, sick, and mentally drained. They had been part of an army that had been in constant retreat for months, fighting an enemy that seemed increasingly unstoppable. But despite the physical and mental toll that the war had taken on them, most of the POWs still held on to their sense of military discipline and duty. They had been trained to endure hardship, to push through pain, and to survive. Yet, nothing in their training could have prepared them for what awaited them on the other side of the world. In the vast, dusty ranches of Texas, upon arrival, the POWs were introduced to a completely new way of life. Texas, with its sweeping plains, towering mesas, and expansive cattle ranches, was a far cry from the battlefields and ruins of Europe. The prisoners, many of whom had been used to the cold, industrialized environments of Germany or the harsh deserts of North Africa, found themselves in a completely unfamiliar environment. The heat was intense, the work was physical, and the ranching lifestyle was unlike anything they had ever experienced. The ranchers in Texas, many of whom had little formal education but vast practical knowledge, were accustomed to hard physical labor. They had grown up on ranches or farms and knew how to care for livestock, maintain the land, and survive in the rough environment. For them, the arrival of POWs was an opportunity to get much-needed help with the everyday tasks of running a cattle ranch. However, they had little experience managing prisoners of war, and many of them simply saw the POWs as a labor force that could contribute to the upkeep of their ranches. The cultural clash between the German POWs and the Texans could not have been more stark. The German soldiers were used to military life, where discipline and order were paramount. They had been trained to work in strict formations and to follow orders without question. But life on a Texas ranch was entirely different. There was little structure, and the work was often solitary, done in the heat of the day under the harsh Texas sun. The POWs, used to military life, were now faced with the task of herding cattle, mending fences, and performing other demanding chores that required practical knowledge and a strong work ethic. For many of the POWs, the initial shock came from the realization that they would be performing physical labor on a scale they had never encountered before. The Germans were accustomed to a military structure in which their duties were often confined to specific roles, from infantry to artillery or logistics. But working on a cattle ranch was different. It required a diverse set of skills, from understanding animal behavior to managing large herds of livestock. Skills many of the German soldiers lacked. The first days and weeks on the ranches were marked by confusion, frustration, and sometimes outright fear. The POWs, many of whom had been part of elite military units, were unaccustomed to the kind of work they were being asked to do. Many had never been near cattle or horses and had no idea how to handle them. They found themselves being taught basic ranching skills, such as how to properly rope a steer or repair a fence. For the Germans, who had been trained to fight wars, not manage cattle, these tasks seemed impossible. The Texans, on the other hand, were accustomed to hard, physical labor. Many had grown up in rural areas, working alongside their families on ranches or farms. The notion of hard work under the sun was second nature to them, and they didn't understand why the POWs struggled so much. The Texans' approach to managing the POWs was often informal. They didn't have a formal training program for the prisoners, nor did they have specific guidelines for how to handle them. Instead, they treated the POWs much as they would have treated any other workers, teaching them what needed to be done on a day-to-day basis and giving them the tools to accomplish the tasks. But the cultural misunderstandings ran deeper than just work expectations. The German POWs, many of whom came from large cities or industrialized areas, were often bewildered by the rural, unpolished lifestyles of the Texans. They had not grown up in the rugged frontier environment that many of the Texans had, and they were initially put off by the roughness of life on the ranch. In contrast, the Texans had little understanding of the disciplined, militaristic nature of the German soldiers. They did not realize that the POWs had been trained to endure hardship and survive in extreme conditions, but not necessarily to work in an environment that required physical labor. Despite the initial difficulties, the POWs began to adapt. Some quickly learned the skills required to manage cattle and maintain the ranch, while others struggled but ultimately adjusted to their new lives. As time went on, the Texans began to see the value of the German POWs, not only for their work ethic, but for the unique skills they brought with them. In some cases, the POWs had agricultural experience, having worked on farms or in other rural settings before joining the military. These skills proved invaluable to the Texans, who recognized that they could learn from the prisoners just as much as the prisoners could learn from them. For the Germans, life on the ranch was a stark contrast to the military life they had known. They were no longer soldiers engaged in war. They were laborers, working for the benefit of their captors. And yet, despite the hardships they faced, many of them found a sense of purpose in the work they were doing. Some POWs even found that they enjoyed the labor, seeing it as a form of escape from the harshness of their wartime experiences. As the war came to a close and the POWs were eventually released or repatriated to Germany, their time in Texas would remain with them. Many would return to Europe and rebuild their lives, but the experience of working on a Texas ranch would forever be a part of their memories. Some even found themselves drawn to ranching or farming after the war, taking what they had learned in Texas and applying it to their new lives.